over to Jen and to the rest of the EDI panel. Thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'm glad to see so many people are here. In line with our work around equity, diversity, and inclusion, it felt important to maybe get some examples of where people are at with respect to the maturity models with the industry leadership, program development, organizational culture, and their sorts of things. So a group of our colleagues have volunteered to present some information about what's happening in their state. We did get a handout in the email yesterday that identifies what's happening in each of the states that are going to talk. So this will be kind of a high level overview. And with that, we'll start with the Western Council folks, Nicole, Colleen, Jennifer Patterson, and Mark Smith. You want to take it away, Nicole?
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you guys. I just set my little timer to make sure I don't go out of time. So in Colorado, the EDI work, I think like many of us, this has been going on for quite some time and really coming out of the events last summer in particular and a racial reckoning around the country. I had some newer to the state library employees get really passionate about wanting to put some action behind our words about what we believe and what we support. So they approached me about, can we put together a plan for the state library? Again, in Colorado, we live in the Colorado Department of Education. They are trying to put together a plan as well. However, we're just a little bit more agile in the state library. There's only 45 of us. So we got cracking on that. And in the handout that came out yesterday, you will see our EDI plan. And they've nicknamed the team EDIT, so Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity Team. And we presented this, so this was in the works over a series of months in the fall, and we presented this to the entire state library in January. I will say that it was really well received. We've also worked on a follow-up survey for state library staff to kind of indicate where they're at right now with EDI work. Where they may have interest, where they may have fear, what their experience has been like at the state library. We're gonna issue that survey to all staff in the state library in March, and we're gonna try and reintroduce that survey once a year to see if we're moving the needle on people's reactions around EDI work. The other thing I'll mention with regard to this plan, so this plan has 6 activities. There's 5 goals. If you guys have any questions as you get into that, please let me know. Jason was kind enough to review this for me in the fall to see if I might have any blind spots on the work that we were putting together. The other thing that's been going on at the State Library in Colorado is we actually, ironically, had a training, an EDI training in May, probably a week before George Floyd's murder. And so that the timing was great in that we had just had, and that wasn't a required training. There was about 30 of us that attended though, and it was an EDI training. And then we had the tragedy about a week later. So it lent us some shared language and some shared experience to kind of revisit and regroup as a staff to kind of recognize what was going on and kind of talk through that. So that was a gift. So we did that training. Then we also offered another training, and I'm happy to share out the contact for either of these trainers. We did something called Privileged Layer Cake, and it is actually developed by a PhD, Kawana Bright is her name, and I can send you her information, but it's really interesting. It looks at the different privileges that all of us have. And she's just a mad baker and actually had come up with the idea of privileged layer cake while she was baking a cake. So it was just looking at the different inherent layers that privilege has. And so many of us took that training also in the fall. So the other thing I'll just mention real quickly is that the other thing that we've been doing before we finalize this EDI plan at the State Library, for those of us who were still wanting to really kind of connect and come together and reflect after the events of the summer, we put together something called Small Bites. And it is about a group of 15 of us that get together once a month at the State Library. And we Zoom together, and there's 2 co-facilitators, and they provide us with something to react to. So whether we all listen to a podcast or we all read an article together, and then we come together for an hour and we reflect. And we had our Small Bites meeting this week on Monday, and we actually looked at a document that was created in the UK, where they're looking at different uses of language and some barriers that we have, illegal alien and the history of that. And so it was a style guide actually that a PR firm came out with in the UK, and we all reacted to that together. So I will say that has been, literally a huge scale of like 15 of us want to talk about this all the time. We get together once a month, all the way to we have now a 6-pronged approach and a plan that we're adopting and finding champions to support these different objectives. So it's very scalable what we've been doing in Colorado. So I'm happy to talk offline with anybody who has questions, but it has just really given an outlet for everybody on my team to find a place, depending on where they are in their journey around all of this and where their comfort level is. Obviously, the 15 of us that get together and riff off of each other once a month are really into this stuff. But that's not everybody in the state library. That leaves 30 people out who don't want to do that every month. So I'm happy to share any of these ideas or talk in depth offline with any of you, but that's just a little bit of a profile of what's happening at the Colorado State Library.
Thank you, Nicole. That sounds really interesting. It sounds like Colorado is doing some great things. I thought I'd just take a minute to share with you what's going on in Utah. We have a strong EDI component at our state library as well. It's maybe fostered because we have the Multicultural Affairs office in our bigger Department of Heritage and Arts with us. And so that's the statewide office that has been doing EDI types of things. And so when everything started to happen, we just took a serious look at EDI and what we could do about it. One thing that we did just really off the bat in June of 2020 is that I asked all of our employees, we have 57 employees fully staffed. And so I asked all of our employees to put something that had to do with EDI into their performance plan. And that was easier for some than others. Basically, some of the warehouse workers, they had to look to try to understand what they could do about that. But I asked everybody to put something into their performance plan. And that was helpful because we got some really solid projects out of that, because somebody said, well, I can do this solid project. And another one said, well, I can work as a group with these other people to do this solid project. But it took the supervisors and the employees to think more about EDI. So we did that. And then we've had several discussions with our Multicultural Affairs team about what we could all do to support EDI in the state of Utah. We did do a 6-week training program that was all centered around that, where every day you had to read or look at something, watch something on the computer or any of the social media types of things. You had to do something, comment on it in a comment thing, and then once a week we had a conversation with all of the other people in our larger department. And so that was maybe 150 people. So we got together to talk about the various things that were discussed in the thing that we were all reading together. And that was on a shared Canvas platform. And that was really interesting. 6 weeks of everybody doing the same thing and following the same types of trains of thoughts. We've also had a really interesting discussion called Dismantling Institutional Racism in Your Library, taught by Tobin Millie Shearer. He's the Director of African American Studies at the University of Montana. We had a presentation by him in our last Director's Summit, which of course was all online. And then we put together a lot of training that's available on our website for library directors and others, that they can just go through that. And we've just been trained. I think the main thing is having something that you can do and keeping the momentum up. It's real easy to say, okay, I went to my 6-week training, now I'm fully versed on that, and that's it. And yet there's so much more that we can do in terms of policy, in terms of actual doing things. I don't know. I guess we've taken seriously EDI in Utah and have tried to make changes no matter where we are in the United States of America. There's something that can be done. So thank you.
Thank you, Colleen, for that. Very interesting work going on in Utah. And I really appreciated your thoughts about keeping the momentum going. And I think that's so important. I'm going to talk a little bit about Oregon. And I started my position as state librarian in May of 2019. And soon we began working on a new strategic plan. And that strategic plan was adopted by our board in March of 2020. Just as COVID was hitting and just as the racial unrest and reckoning was happening during the summer. And so it kind of felt like overnight our plan in some ways really needed to pivot. And our original plan, strategic plan, did include some initiatives directly related to equity, diversity, and inclusion, but we just didn't feel like it fully captured our commitment and action in that area, especially as it continued to evolve during 2020. So we worked with staff to develop an anti-racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion statement and goals. And that was adopted by the State Library Board in January of this year. And that's to supplement our strategic plan. And I wanted to talk just about two of those goals today. You have a link to the full goals in the document that was distributed. And I want to specifically talk about the work in collaboration with the Oregon Library Association. So the first thing I want to mention is the Oregon Library Association's Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Anti-Racism Toolkit. OLA had created a task force charged with making recommendations to the association related to equity, diversity, inclusion. And those recommendations were finalized in April of 2020. One of those recommendations from the task force was to create a toolkit for library administrators and managers focused on leading and implementing EDI and anti-racism practices and initiatives in their libraries. When this recommendation came out, I reached out to that task force, which had become a standing committee within OLA, to see how the state library could support their efforts in developing that toolkit. And we had a great meetings and conversation and agreed that the state library would contribute money. So we provided monetary support in the development of a toolkit, which is being produced both in print with a copy for every local library in the state, as well as an electronic version. We also contributed some content. There's some information about the state library and the services that we provide for local library workers, as well as an article about advocating for EDI and anti-racism when your community is not receptive, that was written by one of our program managers. We're also hosting a survey for the committee on through our survey tool that is going out to library workers right now to gather information about their understanding of EDI and anti-racism work and how they think their libraries are doing in this area. And the committee is going to be discussing the results of that survey at the upcoming OLA conference in April. And so we're compiling that survey data for them so that they have the information they need for that. And we are hosting the toolkit on the state library's website. It's on a LibGuide where we have other EDI learning resources for local library workers. And we participated in a training session where the toolkit was rolled out to library directors on the information in the toolkit. And we just feel like the OLA and EDI and Anti-Racism Committee did such an amazing job of developing this toolkit. You've got a link to it in your resources. And we were really happy to be able to support their efforts in this development of this great resource. The second thing I wanted to mention is the first state librarian in Oregon. Her name was Cornelia Marvin Pierce, and there's a plaque of her hanging in the state library. Last summer, state library staff suggested that we find out more about her past, given that there was some understanding by some staff that she had some racist aspects of her past. I, being new, knew nothing about her. I said, yes, please explore. Let's find out what we can. And so after doing some research, state library staff discovered that she was married to a former Oregon state governor, Walter M. Pierce, and he was known to be associated with the Ku Klux Klan. She was also a strong proponent of eugenics and a supporter of the American Breeders Association, and she viewed her promotion of the sterilization law as an extension of her responsibilities as state librarian and also as a tool for improving society. Needless to say, we were very troubled by this information that we discovered. And so we have a state library history page on our website. We updated that page to include these elements of her past. And then we had to decide what we should do with the plaque that was hanging in the second floor. It has her name and image. And so we talked about removing the plaque, and we also talked about putting up a contextual statement. Ultimately, we decided to put up a statement next to the plaque that provides information about her support of eugenics and her association with racist movements. Our thinking was that this would allow visitors to learn about this aspect of our agency's past. We also supported a state library staff member in writing an article on this topic for the Oregon Library Association's quarterly publication, the summer issue, which was devoted actually to articles all about the state library. And in the article, the staff member mentioned the plaque and the contextual statement that we had posted. After the article was published, we received some concerns from local library community regarding the plaque still hanging in the building, feeling like by having a plaque at all, it was honoring Cornelia Marvin Pierce. And so we acknowledged those concerns, and we reached out to the OLA's EDI Anti-Racism Committee to invite further discussion and feedback. And this has been months in the making, but we finally have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow, actually. So more to come on how we're going to resolve this particular issue. But we'll be discussing with them their feedback and explore additional strategies for addressing this plaque and this troubling aspect of our agency's history. And I just want to note that it's really wonderful in Oregon to have a partner like the Oregon Library Association that shares our commitment to EDI and anti-racism efforts. And it's been great to collaborate with them to address EDI topics and provide resources for local library staff. And you have all links to the resources I mentioned in the packet. I'm happy to entertain any questions as we move on. Thank you.
That's a great story, Jennifer. Wow. I'm glad we don't have to deal with that in Texas, but it sounds like you handled it really well. So in Texas, just tell you a couple of things about what we're working on. We've been kind of on a two-track process with our EDI, and I wish I could say we started on this a lot earlier than we did, but we've been, I think too many organizations, we've been late to the party as well. But one thing that we had done going back to 2019 is that we did create a position of inclusive services librarian, and the intention of that position was to oversee our efforts in how this is in our library development and networking division, and to kind of oversee efforts of how libraries are developing programs that are going to be, inclusive in their communities, but also how to ensure that the programs at the state library and that our public-facing efforts acknowledged equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so in October of 19, we did hire a very talented individual in that role, and I was really pleased with that hire. And that individual was getting started and working on these things in the fall of 19 and then early 20, and then bang, the pandemic hit and changed a lot of the things that we were working on, and kind of postponed a lot of the workshops that we were doing and changed the nature of that. Meanwhile, on an internal track, I think like a lot of organizations, we had understood for a long time that we were overdue in taking kind of I guess you'd say a holistic approach to addressing equity, diversity, and inclusion. We knew in particular that we had a specific problem with diversity recruiting in our staff, and we had begun to consider, whether we wanted to hire a consultant or what kind of steps we needed to take to try to build a more diverse workforce, especially at the senior levels of our agency. And then the social justice movement and all of the events of last summer occurred, and in Congress, we had an intense series of conversations with our staff, and really talking about one of the things that's happened since the pandemic is that we have regular agency-wide staff meetings. We had never had that before on any kind of regular basis, and we've had like 26 of them so far since the pandemic started. So they've become a real regular feature of our agency and an opportunity to share information with staff and each other. And one of the things we just said is we've got to do something. And it was the staff was very insistent that we do it, and the senior management was also very much wanting to do that, myself included. But we didn't exactly know how to start. We thought we should form an EDI committee or some kind of EDI initiative. If you had asked me, I would say that we have tried to make mutual respect between staff and between staff and the clients that we serve some of the kind of key organizational cultural elements of our agency. But I know that it's kind of a definitional nature of bias that you don't see what you don't see. And we wanted to make sure that we were able to identify any intrinsic biases in our organization and address those. So I kind of cast around. I didn't want to necessarily assume that our inclusive services librarian would be the one that we tapped to do this. So I consulted with her about, along with other people about, how to proceed and so forth, because this is the work she's doing with libraries across the state. And, kind of one thing came to another, and I just finally said, look, will you lead our internal team in this regard? And I was very gratified that she said yes, and very happy that she said yes, and everybody was relieved. But I would stop there and just say that I was prepared for her to say no, because even though she is our organizational subject matter expert in this area, she is a person of color. And I think that one of the pitfalls of this process is that we tend to put too much burden on people of color to take the lead in these things. And she already had a full-time job doing this kind of work with the state. So I didn't want to just assume that we could rely on her and just kind of put this work on to her. But she was, being the exceptional individual she is, she was very willing to take it on, and that's good. So the committee was formed in the summer, and they have made a lot of progress, but I would consider that they are still in the early days of their work. But they have held several staff forums to talk about various issues. They have rolled out a survey, which is now open, and they are collecting data collecting responses from staff. They are considering what they have an intention, and they have I guess you'd say authority from myself and the administrative team to hire a consultant to come in and work with them as a committee, but also with staff to be able to kind of figure out where we are in terms of our EDI response. We have determined that we're going to give each staff person in the agency like a bank of hours that they can use in EDI training, and we're going to offer them a variety of different types of EDI training that they can do. So we're kind of moving forward on a number of those aspects. One thing that we're also doing internally is that we're revising and consolidating some of our policies, in particular our personnel policies for the agency. So we've been going through a period of time where we're kind of looking at all of our disparate policies and pulling them together and revising them. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to run those policies by our EDI committee to have them review those and comment on those, and make sure that the things that we're doing as an agency policy-wise are inclusive and embracing of those principles. Meanwhile, on the kind of the public-facing side, we are continuing to do this work outside the agency. One of the items in my resource page is an EDI library survey that is intended to assess the status of library responsiveness to EDI across the state, and to get kind of a sense of where we need to be in terms of training and work with libraries to engage them around these topics. There's also a blog post that you'll see in there from our library developments blog regarding the National Day of Racial Healing on January 19th. So our staff rolled out some programming around that, and there's a resource page there. And so there's a good amount of information there on that as well, which I think is, I found it particularly useful. So I just want to just kind of comment that I think that one of the things that we're talking about internally is, and especially in terms of our discussions about personnel policies and so forth, is, you know, how are we going back to the original thing of how are we going to create a diverse workforce within our agency, and how do we balance that with some of our requirements for ALA accredited MLSs and that type of experience. I think that is that's a discussion that's going to play out on a number of fronts, and I think it's going to be something that we as a profession are going to need to address and to think about and to look at. And I think it's going to be a difficult discussion, but I think on an internal basis, we're going to have that discussion. I think a lot of library organizations are going to be having that, and I hope within COSLA that's something we can talk about as well. Just to conclude, our overall goal is to ensure that staff in our agency feel, you know, free to express themselves at work, free to be fully engaged and actualized in their work, and to really fulfill our, you know, what we consider to be our organizational culture, that we are respectful of one another and of our client groups. So I think we are in good shape there in some ways, but I need for our EDI committee to advise senior management on what we need to do to address anything that's interfering with those objectives. And I think we've got a ways to go, but I'm glad we're on the path. I wish we'd been on the path sooner, but I can just say that this type of interaction in COSLA is super, super helpful, and I applaud Jen and my colleagues for the work that you're doing and sharing. And I just in the last half hour, I've gotten tons of great ideas. So I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. In the interest of time, we'll move on to our next group of folks from COSLine, which would be Jason, James, and Karen. You see everybody on the screen? I see Jason, the only one that I get you. And we'll hear about what's happening up in the Northeast quadrant.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to set my timer and keep this very brief because as librarians, we can all read what I've already typed for you in the PDF, but I'll highlight from a large way what we are doing here in Vermont. Vermont has had a really wonderful culture when I arrived of things that they have been doing since the 1960s by having a diverse book collection for libraries across the state. So I was really surprised and wonderful to see that already in place. Within that, though, we have two sides that we're kind of navigating. In the items that I have provided you, I have been afforded some interesting conversations that allow the state library to explore what it means to go into DEI work on a variety of levels. So, for example, a conversation was held between the administration and a social equity caucus that has a large attendee amount of legislators on my participation in the caucus. That, of course, would be something unusual to have someone of the executive branch, which I'm a part of here, in a caucus itself. But they did come to a compromise, and the governor agreed to allow me as an attendee, but the caucus wanted me as a member. And I will say the governor and I do talk very frequently, and he simply asked, do you think they want you in there because you're Black? And I said, yes, they do. That's exactly what they want. So within that, it allowed him to kind of understand how some things were to transpire. But that was just a really interesting situation that developed. But we have a social equity director for the state that looks through a variety of lenses, and I connect with her as well as a whole variety of other people to do various projects. So we also have embarked upon what is known as our DEI policy budget impact tool assessment, which means that when we look at things, we also take the review of who is not at the table. Did you speak with different people? And so mine is very, very simple because libraries kind of should be doing this already. But for other state entities such as agriculture, building and general services, parks and rec, if they want to do something, they might not have talked to specific groups. So it does reset. Have you included the voices that you need to understand how things might roll out from a state government perspective? With that, I also participate very frequently with the Vermont Commission on Women and also the Commission on Indian Affairs and a variety of items. We have the Abenaki that we connect with on a variety of items. The most unusual thing that comes into DEI for the state library is that our state library board continues to do geographic naming since the inception of the state. And that is a unique item because we get to name things when it comes to geographic features. Right at the moment, I am in the midst of a weird conversation with a variety of people on something that we have here that they wish for it to be renamed, but we are also in the process of understanding why it was named that in the first place. So on our map, when you do have geographic naming, it is usually also connected to the USGS, and it allows to be on a federal map. So you can search that we have Negro Brook is in Vermont, and there are some people who feel that that is an inappropriate name. I did have to have a discussion openly, which is recorded, on the term Negro. It is not considered racist or discriminatory. It can be outdated. But within that, there's just wonderful conversation that we're having because some people say pull down the name and other people say, why was it named that in the first place? And yes, there were Black people in Vermont on the early parts of the formation of the state itself, even though New Hampshire said it had Vermont and New York said it had Vermont. Just letting you know, Vermont became its own state saying, well, the hell with both of you, we're going to make ourselves our own thing, because a lot of people didn't know that. But since the inception, there have been a lot of people of free slaves and a variety of people who emigrated trying to get to Canada. So that's an unusual fact that most people might not know. So we are dealing with that as a conversation in the state. We also have weird items, but nice things that also allow this. I'm asked to speak quite frequently, as James has said, but my most encouraging item that allowed a lot of people to thank me for being in Vermont and being the state librarian was to, believe it or not, be the first Vermont Fairy Tale Festival king, which I had a court of, believe it or not, 50 people. And I was in full garb, dressed as a king with a queen who was another librarian. And yes, this is not the most appropriate term, but I had wenches and a whole bunch of things. So it was quite interesting. So just know that we took DEI to its full inception. Inclusivity also for us means talking to special populations like veterans, those who are impaired and handicapped, and also some very unique groups. So we have it all in our document, and feel free to connect me on what we're doing, but we look forward to all the programs that we are trying to navigate for our libraries as well when it comes to services for dementia patients, if you're homeless, what that looks like, and of course, LGBTQIA services. So thank you, and I'll take any questions afterwards, and I will pass on to the next person.
Thank you, Jason. That's great. Wow, to be the king of that was pretty cool. We don't have something quite like that in Massachusetts. For that matter, I wish I regularly talked with our governor. It doesn't happen all that frequently. But in any case, good afternoon and good morning, depending on where my colleagues are. So we have a new strategic plan here just as of last fall, and actually it's a major theme in our plan, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I should mention the example that I included, I think I messed up. I sent in a one-pager, which was specifically the pulled out section for our reviewers, our State Advisory Council and libraries reviewers for our LSTA subgrants. And then I did send along, just as a reference, the entire, so I think you got the whole thing. But just so you know, I basically, one concrete thing that came out of our new strategic plan with the focus on EDI is looking, for example, we have a pretty strong LSTA subgrant program, about $500,000 a year. And we just talked about, well, how can we have 17 grant categories, but we just said, how can we make sure that our new plan really, that it's operationalized? And this was one area working with the LSTA funds. So just wanted to mention a few things about it. So this is, again, the first year that we're actually using this. So it's on the application. There's an actual statement right at the top of the application that the MBLC is committed to promoting and supporting EDI in libraries. Throughout the applications, libraries should consider how the proposed project will address EDI and be able to articulate how it applies in each section. And this is part of the scoring methodology for the review committee. So I won't, go over the detail that's actually in the handout, but you can just get an idea. And I think I do want to give credit to the Alaska Association of Libraries, because we actually use that, and also from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, 2 different documents in developing these materials for our LSTA review. So did also want to mention, so we do require attendance at a workshop, grant writing workshop, where this was discussed in detail and questions were answered related to it. And again, the process we have, as I think most states that have a sub-grant program or a direct grant program, we call it a direct grant program here. We're currently in the process where we've gotten draft applications, so we're reviewing them, but the final applications aren't due for a few months. So I just was really pleased to see that, because frankly, one of the reasons I've been really pleased to be involved in the EDI group here at COSLA is really to learn from you all, from my colleagues, about the good work you're doing, so we can bring some of that back here. And this is just something that, we pretty quickly were able to develop on our side. So happy to answer any questions when we get to the end, because I know we're going to try to keep moving along. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, James. And thank you, everyone, for all the great information that we've heard so far. I did not include anything in the package. I was busy tracing legislation, but I have shot into the chat Rhode Island's resource that would be helpful to guide you through this conversation, or as a resource you can take a look at later. So as Nicole mentioned when she kicked us all off at the beginning of the session, we've been working on EDI for a little while now. It began about 4 years ago as a conversation. I wouldn't even call it a committee. It was just a group of people interested in these issues. And that started with a group that we have in Rhode Island called Cornucopia. It is the Librarians of Color. And they would approach me to talk about these topics. So we started having some informal conversations with them, with our Graduate School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Rhode Island, with the Rhode Island Library Association, and of course with our office, to kind of look at what we could do to help move the needle on inclusion and diversity. And those conversations led us to including it into our new 5-year strategic plan that we rolled out in 2018. But then we were faced with this conundrum that many of us face. How do we operationalize what we've been talking about? How do we try to move the needle? And for those of you just starting out or on the road, it's been a very gradual process in Rhode Island. But looking back and putting this presentation together today, I realize that we have made some changes. The changes are incremental, but we are on our way to creating more inclusion in Rhode Island libraries. And we've really been focused on looking outward and what the support that we can provide to our libraries, because we are a library development agency. We do not have a library, so we have a very small team at our office. So what our first big step was we did an EDI summit, a full day-long summit in the summer of 2019, where we invited speakers from different areas, different voices to be heard from. And we also embedded a workshop component to it. So we had speakers from our Indigenous peoples, the director of the Tamaquag Museum for the Narragansetts, which are the Native peoples in Rhode Island. We had folks from the Latino community, from the refugee community, from the trans community, as well as the accessibility community, because we wanted to present these different aspects of diversity, of inclusion. So the second part of the day-long session was presented by a group called Diversity Talks. They're teen facilitators that have been groomed to talk about issues in diversity and their experiences in marginalized, underrepresented communities and minority communities. So that was really informative as we started talking about implicit bias, which several people have mentioned earlier, and really assessing where we are in terms of that and trying to understand what the issues are before we can actually move forward. So out of this workshop part of this day-long summit, we ended up with a number of ideas for action. And one of those is a resource guide that I put into the chat a little earlier. We've built that out fairly substantially. We embarked on a program of trainings in the fall of 2019, specifically focusing at that point in time on homelessness, using Ryan Dowd and using his online guide. It's a self-paced tutorial. And then as Mark mentioned, the pandemic came along and got in the way of all of this. So we had to shift our programming and move it online. But one of the programs that has been really successful, and I want to give a shout out to Timothy down in North Carolina, is a program that was started as an IMLS grant at the University of North Carolina, and that is Project Ready, which stands for reimagining equity and access for diverse youth. So it's a year-long in-depth training program, similar to what one of my colleagues was talking to about a little earlier, when Nicole was talking about the small bites. What it is we've assembled cohorts of librarians, and they delve into the curriculum of Project Ready. And again, it's a full year-long program. These people meet every 2 weeks. These are librarians, youth services librarians around the state. We have 4 cohorts with up to 8 people in them. One of our staff members facilitates one cohort, but the others are facilitated by librarians in the community. And they delve into the topics of this Project Ready program, discuss it, and figure out how they can move forward. So one of the ways we're going to support this group of very dedicated librarians who are about halfway through this process is providing grants for collection development to diversify collections. So I'll move along to the final part of how we're looking at this. Our earlier action steps as we continue this journey is diversity audits of collections. We've done some trainings on that. And people have been diligently going in and trying to audit very small sections of their collections, whether it's graphic novels or some of your early reader materials, but they're doing it in silos at their own library. So we have just begun conversations with our public library consortium to try to pull the people who are already working on this, educate more people on doing diversity audits of collection, and then getting it into our statewide catalog. We have one public library consortium, one statewide catalog. So it doesn't make any sense to me that people are doing this work and putting it in spreadsheets where it works for the local library, but it's not shared on a wider basis. So we're going to be looking at doing a collection, a diversity audit of the collection of Rhode Island libraries, again, focusing on small components of that collection, probably starting with youth services so that we can present more materials in own voices. So that's the big initiative that we've really just begun talking about. So I'll have more on that later. And just going back again to the concept of these really concentrated learning cohorts, we're working with the Library Association on a project with a peer-to-peer university, training librarians to be facilitators. We have 20 librarians going through this course right now, but what's going to happen on the end side of it is they're going to take a specific topic on anti-racism, and then they will have been trained in facilitation, so they can then run facilitations in their libraries or for the general public based on this training that we've been able to coordinate and support through a generous grant from one of our library vendors. So those are the actions that we're taking in Rhode Island, working with our library community. And again, those resources are on our LibGuide in the chat. So thank you very much. If there are any questions, happy to answer them if people want to email me at any point in time. So thank you.
Thanks, Karen. And all of our COSLA friends. Lisa Aiken is representing the Southern Council, so she's got broad shoulders this afternoon to be talking about what's happening in the Southern Council.
Hey, Jen and everybody else. Feel free to share the screen though and add my other Southern people to it. I'm perfectly happy with that. We met as a group, and then I put together our ideas, and our ideas to share with you all are broken out into 2 different sections. So internal facing ideas and then external facing ideas. I'm going to start with internal and go from there. And if anybody in Southern Council wants to add to either while I'm talking, I have a big family, so you won't bother me if you interrupt, or if you want to wait to the end, that's fine too. So some of our internal facing ideas that we have done in our libraries are create an idea committee, which many of you have talked about as well. An idea stands for inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. Some have created an inclusive language guide. I think this is really important and key, especially when you're first maybe starting out internally, is to talk about appropriate language, and then to look through your communication, either internally with policies and procedures, or maybe in job postings, and see if there are any barriers that the language that you're currently using may create for people of differences. And that difference can be any variety of things, which I think is also important to this discussion. When I first started talking about equity and diversity and inclusion, my staff didn't necessarily know what I was talking about years ago. I don't know, and we're all in different places. I know even some of the people in Southern Council, they haven't started anything yet. And so I think that that is an important first part as well, which is what are we talking about with equity or diversity and inclusion? For us, we're talking about everybody. We want everyone, and we worked through that obviously when we did our model when we came through our COSLA statement. But it is important to start having those discussions, because at least for me internally, it was, oh, okay, so we're just talking about race, or we're just talking about abilities, or we're just talking about any cultural differences. We really are talking about everybody, but you have to define who is everybody. Okay, some other ideas that we have done internal are engage in training. We've used the Racial Equity Institute, and I've shared that on our resource. I'm happy to share it again, and done some training internally. We've worked hard on posting our job announcements with traditional HBCUs. And then some other COSLA colleagues of mine have worked with the HBCU Library Alliance and the ALA Black Caucus on posting jobs. Great idea, I think. Be committed to hiring a diverse staff. Dedicate a library development consultant specifically to a position specifically to equity, diversity, and inclusion to help in the field. Provide continuing education and training on topics to staff regarding race, diversity, etc. And allow staff, this is something that I'm not sure how many of you all are doing this, but we are doing this, to use personal pronouns in their signature block. I'll tell you from experience, be prepared for some uncomfortableness when those pronouns change, but I see that as another opportunity for just open conversation and understanding, which is part of what we're trying to create. And I've heard a lot of you already who have presented today say the same thing, that you want to create an environment internally where your staff feel comfortable to talk about themselves and any other topics. So we've added the personal pronouns if someone wants to include in their signature block. We hold open group discussions, many of us in Southern Council, with our staff. At the State Library, we have civic dinners, and Nicole mentioned something that sort of reminded me of what we do. Nicole mentioned having a topic that they provide something every month to talk about as a group, and it's voluntary. We're doing something similar to that with civic dinners with our staff. It's not really at dinner. The next one's at 10:30 in the morning, but it's a topic maybe can be sensitive or uncomfortable for people. And so we start those conversations internally in what we hope is an environment of safety and inclusion. The final item that I have listed for internal facing ideas from our group from Southern Council is a commitment to diversity statement, which a few people have mentioned today as well. Anybody want to share anything else, COSLA Southern Council, before I go to external? Okay, external facing ideas. Conduct accessibility audits for public libraries. Create and/or provide an accessibility toolkits for public libraries to use. Provide additional continuing education opportunities for library staff. We're doing this through, there are so many resources available now that if you're providing training of any kind, you probably have resources available as part of your package. Maybe just look at it if you're not familiar. Let's see, review collections for representations of diverse groups and abilities. Expand digital content of online history resources to reflect different perspectives. Highlight minority collections in social media. Host additional conversations outside of your agency or your own workforce on topics of race, diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion. And then host training on collection development practices and how to find resources that represent different populations of people. Sandy in Virginia is doing something interesting. She's applied for a grant to support a diversity and inclusion fellowship internship program. I'm sure she'll be happy to share some information about that if you'd like. I know it's still in the works. And in Georgia, Julie's doing something additionally interesting, and that is exploring an idea of Leadership Institute for library staff of color based on ALA's spectrum model. Several of us are participating with assistive technology teams in our states. And for us, and I believe a couple of others, we are partnering with our university. We're right next to the University of South Carolina. And so we are partnering with them on increasing the offerings related to EDI in library studies at the university. And we're also participating in Project Ready. So those are our ideas to share with you. Happy to answer any questions. And does anybody else in Southern Council have anything they want to add that I might have left out?
Okay, we'll turn it over to Great Lakes. And I think Kirk Kiefer looks a little different today, and I think he's disguised as Ben Miller, but I'm not gonna make predictions. Ben?
Yeah, I'm here for the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Kurt asked me to be here. And I wish that our Youth and Inclusive Services librarian could be here, but she's actually in a training related to this right now. So I'm the director of the library services team, here to talk about what we're doing in Wisconsin. And so our approach started about 4 years ago as well. I heard that before too. And it really starts from the top down. So we're part of the Department of Public Instruction. So we are the state education agency, and the library team is just a small part of that bigger group. And so equity is not just a goal of the agency, it is the goal. Wisconsin is a very white state. And we have one of the biggest racial equity gaps in education in the country. I think we're 49th, which is not good. And so our being the state education agency, that is the goal, is equity and closing that gap. And so there was really a top-down approach in this. We go through formal and informal training that looks like having very real conversations in small groups within teams and also across teams. We went through that for 2 or 3 years, and that sort of phase has ended. But what came out of that was we have 4 agreements that we use whenever we have meetings inside our agency. And those 4 agreements are that we need to stay engaged, we need to accept and expect non-closure. We're not going to come to answers. We need to speak from I statements and speak our truth, and experience discomfort and the growth that comes from that. And we ground most of our meetings that way, as a way to just remind ourselves of what the work is. That all was started by Tony, who was the head of our agency at that time. But fast forward a couple of years, and Tony is now Governor Evers in Wisconsin. He was elected to state office, and he actually issued an executive order mandating all state agencies to have an equity and inclusion plan to increase diversity in the workforce. And so that work happened in the summer of 2020. Our agency went through to look at how recruitment, retention, and culture can be improved in our agency. And so that has kind of a 2-pronged approach. A lot of it is focused internally, but some of it is pushing back against state policies that might be perpetuating systemic racism that we've identified. So that process was very eye-opening as we looked at the systems that are in place in state government that might perpetuate bias and racism. And I actually just before this was at a team meeting where we were rolling this out and talking about what we're all required to come up with team equity plans. And so we started having that discussion just today. So that has been a way that we see it just sort of like make its way into the work that we do every day. As part of the work that we've done, we've released an inclusive services statement. We actually have equity and diversity and inclusion is listed in our state statutes. And so we took that and had our state superintendent issue an inclusive services statement that was specific to libraries, really to talk about that should be a place where everyone should feel safe, welcome, and respected. We felt like we needed to have a good foundation for our future work by having kind of a statement that could be something we could look back on, almost a policy to say this is where we're coming from and this is how we're interpreting that piece of statute. And so in 2018, we did add an inclusive services section to our LSTA 5-year plan. That's one of our key goal areas. The way that's played out has been interesting because we do a ton of work there. There's a lot of work that gets done in the inclusive services area. Some examples of that would be our professional association hosts an annual conference. And in 2019, that conference, it was the 3rd year that it was held at the Kalahari Resort in the Wisconsin Dells. That is there was a price deal. It was a cheap option to have the conference, but the talk among the librarians as we approach that 3rd year of being there, this is a resort that the theme is just Africa as a whole thing, right? So there's no, just as one unified place. There are literally pictures of people in blackface on the walls. The theme of the conference was about racial equity. It felt really weird. It felt, we had a lot of conversations about, do we even attend this thing? Is this appropriate? This seems really disingenuous with the discussions that we're having internally. We worked with the association and we actually sponsored a pre-conference using LSTA funds around, so you want to talk about race, and we made that free to any librarian who wanted to come, whether or not they were attending the conference, and it was packed. The room was full, and it sent a very strong message. And the association then made some similar comments and actually have decided never to have their conference there again, which seems like progress. But the interesting things are the way that this work manifests outside of the LSTA goal. We recently commissioned a report on ebook usage during the pandemic, and when our staff reviewed that before it was released, which is just happening now, they really pushed back on some of the survey results that said, when they looked at the demographics of the folks that took the survey around ebook use, it was predominantly white women over the age of 55 in Madison, Wisconsin. And just the conversations we had led to that. Is that really indicative of who's using ebooks in the state or who we're serving? So those kind of things were really interesting. We're also involved in Project Ready and do a lot of work there. And then the work that we're doing to sort of push this out into our library community is we really want to focus on local conversations. We see that as the more powerful place, that the conversations we foster are going to pay more dividends than anything we could say or any proclamations we can make. So we created the Inclusive Services Assessment and Guide, which is a couple of years old. It was just a PDF, fillable PDF or printable PDF that looks at different areas of the library and where it's a self-assessment. You look through it, you decide where you can improve or where you need to improve, and then have that conversation with your board. We're looking at improving that, but that is, yeah, and we're right now, the next step of that is creating vignettes of sort of animated videos that talk about that to further encourage, thinking that those will be shown at board meetings or different meetings of librarians where they can have these discussions and actually look at themselves and make changes at the local level, because we see that as the best thing that we can do for our state.
I had no idea about the resort. It's somebody that rings a bell. I didn't know the details behind that. That's fascinating. We have a couple of minutes left, probably for 2 or 3 questions. If folks have questions they want to ask of our panelists or comments or conversation you'd like to have as a group at the moment. I know a lot of people are mentioning they have to get off for a call at the top of the hour, but we still have a few minutes left.
So, Jen, I'm a little embarrassed to ask this question, but several people talked about it. One of you who talked about Project Ready, could you explain what that is?
So I know a little bit about it. It's a curriculum that was developed, I think, by the University of South Carolina Library School through an IMLS grant. And it's a curriculum that takes a cohort through learning about equity, diversity, accessibility, and those sorts of things. So it's really a cohort-based model. I know Rhode Island is doing it. I think Lisa in South Carolina did it. I know Minnesota, they're doing several cohorts. So it's been a popular tool for helping libraries to have a conversation. If I'm not mistaken, it may be focused on youth services, but I'm not positive about that.
Yeah, Jen, it is focused on youth services. I mean, the first part apparently applies to everyone, but we're really leveraging it as a youth services, and that's what the Y in Project Ready is for. Again, it's reimagining equity and access for diverse youth. Came out of UNC, Chapel Hill. And Mary and anybody else who's interested, we have links, and I think Timothy dropped a link into the chat about the project itself. And if you want to see how it's iterating in Rhode Island, including, we have lists of what the topic areas are for these groups to do this in-depth learning together over the course of a year. You can see that on our LibGuide that I'm reposting in the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're doing it in Wisconsin. We did, and I'm not sure if this is how it goes everywhere, but we're doing cohorts of school and public librarians to make that connection and also use it at that angle to have in communities, the school and publics work together and learn this together and then iterate it outward.
Lisa put a little more information about South Carolina in the chat, and Timothy, thank you for correcting me on it being North Carolina, not South Carolina, that developed the program. I think we have time for one more question, comment, observation.
Hi, this is Sarah from Washington.
Hi, Sarah.
And at some point, there's some really great work going on in California that we were deeply engaged with. A 3-year LSTA grant in partnership with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. So maybe at some time that could be, we could ask Greg to give some info about that.
Great. Yeah, they've been doing good work with libraries.
I seem to be having a little bit of trouble. I thought that I could maybe just save the chat on my own, but is it possible to save the chat and email it out so that we can have use of some of these, some of the links that are in the chat?
Emily, Tim?
Okay, Tim says it's possible.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Good. Good. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining and sticking with us this afternoon, especially to our panelists for taking the onus to share and collect the information and put together a resource guide. And for those that are interested, there is an EDI engagement group meeting coming up probably the 3rd week in March, I think. If you're interested in that, just drop a note and make sure you get an invitation on the link to it. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everybody on the panel. That was fantastic.